So let's start with what happens without any community action. Pictured here is a business as usual forecast developed by the city's consultant, AECOM. The red line you see at the top for 2030 and 2040 is based on 2019 trends using industry standard methodologies, but it leaves out some trends that began in 2020, including the increase in remote work resulting from the pandemic, as well as market shifts from Governor Newsom's September 2020 executive order directing that by 2035, all new cars and passenger trucks sold in California should be zero-emission vehicles. So in this chart, you will also see an adjusted business as usual forecast in yellow that takes these trends into account. We're expecting a large increase in telecommuting, but it has less of an impact on emissions than you might think. If we assume that 50% of employees citywide are eligible for remote work and that they opt for 2 days a week of remote work on average, then commute vehicle miles traveled could be reduced by between 8 to 11% compared to 2019 levels, which is about a 3% reduction in on-road transportation emissions relative to 2019 levels, or a 2.8% reduction relative to 1990 levels. As for electric vehicle projections, Palo Alto currently has one of the highest electric vehicle adoption rates in the country. 30% of new car sales in Palo Alto are EVs versus 8% for California and 2.3% for the United States as a whole. About 50% of new California vehicle sales in California are expected to be EVs in 2030, according to some forecasts, which is the assumption we used for Palo Alto. The forecast is highly uncertain, though, and could be either higher or lower depending on a variety of factors. Under an adjusted business as usual scenario, Palo Alto emissions are projected to decrease about 52.1% in 2030 and 59.6% in 2040 relative to the 1990 baseline. Overall, the adjusted business as usual forecast was about 37,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent lower than the AECOM forecast, leaving an additional 217,745 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in reductions needed to achieve 80 by 30. And now I'll turn the presentation over to Jonathan, who's going to talk about the effects of policies versus business as usual.
Thank you, Christine. Again, Jonathan Abendschein, Assistant Director of Utilities Resource Management, and a citywide team of staff from across the organization did a great deal of modeling in partnership with a city's consultant, AECOM, and we have results to present in the following slides. This chart, kicking off, gets into the contributions of different SCAP policies as compared to what happens under a business as usual scenario. And the thick red line you're seeing at the top shows the AECOM business as usual forecast that Christine presented in the previous slides. You also, in yellow here, see the staff adjustments for electric vehicle adoption and telecommuting that Christine also presented in the previous slides. Further down, you start to see the effects of mobility, EV, and buildings policies on emissions. And you also see the additional remaining emissions reductions that staff needs to identify to help the community achieve 80% by 2030. It's important to acknowledge here that the goals and key actions that we've analyzed do not, while they're very ambitious, they don't achieve that 80% reduction by 2030, only a 72% reduction. So there's an 8% gap that we need to figure out how to close. We anticipate having to do additional studies on how to close that gap, but of course that can be done in parallel with launching programs to start achieving the other emissions reductions that we already analyzed. It's also worth noting here that the momentum created by many of the goals and key actions that we analyzed continues past 2030. And so if these programs are continued past 2030, we forecast achieving 78% reductions by 2035 and 80% by 2036, 2037. And that's even without any additional programs or emissions reductions. And it's also worth noting that some of the effects of our policies generate emissions reductions that are not counted in our greenhouse gas inventory. So for example, if a Palo Alto resident converts an EV as a result of one of the city's programs. The standard methods for doing greenhouse gas inventories mean that only their driving within Palo Alto is counted under the greenhouse gas protocols, inventory protocols. So if that resident commutes out of Palo Alto, for example, the community can only count half of that vehicle trip towards its emission savings. But of course, by adopting that EV, that community member has reduced emissions for the entire journey. And those unclaimed emissions are very large. They're equal to another 6% to 7% reduction in emissions if we could claim them.